What's up guys, I'm Ryan, I'm one of the tutors in the Econ Tutoring Center. Today I'm going to go over a little bit more of the problem that we worked on earlier and talk about some consumer producer surplus, and then later on we'll talk about what happens if we put a price ceiling on the supply and demand here. Remember that the language that we use might be different from your professors, so always confirm to make sure that it's the same. Alright, so we're going to go into this. So we solved for this equilibrium in an earlier video with that supply and that demand equation. So now we're going to talk about what the consumer surplus is in these two, in this situation. So remember that the demand equation represents what, how many units people are willing and able to buy at each price. So at this price, people are willing to pay, or rather, at this price people are willing and able to buy this quantity. At this price, they're willing and able to buy this quantity, and so on and so on. So the idea is that when the price is 300, people would be willing to pay for this unit right here. People would be willing to pay this much for it, and at this quantity, they'd be willing to pay that much for it. But because of the way this market system works out, they don't have to pay. So say for the 50th unit here, they don't have to pay this much for it. They get to pay this market price for each one of these. So this right here is the, sort of the surplus that they get, the surplus that the consumers get from buying these units, right? And if you sum up all of these here, you're going to get that, this guy would have been willing to pay this, but he only has to pay 300. He would have been willing to pay this, but he only has to pay this. If you sum all of this up, you're going to get this triangle here, right, which is your consumer surplus, this upper triangle. Right, and we can calculate that because that is just the area of a triangle, right? And so we just do that by doing 1/2 base times height, so consumer surplus, which is 1/2 base times height. Our base is 100 here, so it's 1/2 times 100, right? And now we just need to find what this is right here. And so we have this bottom point is 300, so we just have to find what this top point is, which is exactly the price on this demand equation over here when quantity is equal to 0. So if we plug in 0 for quantity here, we're going to get the price is 800, which is what the y-axis is here, or I should say the price intercept, I guess, which means that this height right here is 500, right? So 25,000 is our consumer surplus. Then this bottom triangle here, remember this is what supply represents, what suppliers, how much suppliers are willing to supply at each price, or rather how many units, or what price they'd be able to supply a certain amount of units with. So for 50 units, they would be willing to supply that for some lower price down here. Right, 100 units, they need to get 300 to be able to induce them to sell it. And for some smaller units, they would have been willing to sell this for this low price here, but they get to sell it for 300. So they get this much benefit from selling each unit, right? They would have been willing to sell it for this low price, but they get to sell it for 300. And you do that for each unit, just like the consumer surplus, or similar to the consumer surplus. You sum it up and you get this lower triangle here, right? You just sum all of these things up, and you get the area of this lower triangle, which is your producer surplus, which again is just the area of a triangle, which is 1/2. The base is still 100, and the height now is this, so we're going to have to find what this value is, and that is just the price when quantity is equal to 0 on the supply equation. So if we plug in Q equals 0 here, we're just going to get price equals 100, which means that this height is 300 minus 100, so 200. So that's going to be 20,000 divided by 2, which is equal to 10,000. So that's how you calculate, and a little bit of intuition behind what consumer and producer surplus are. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what happens if we put a price ceiling of 200 on this market. So we're going to say a price ceiling equal to $200. Which is essentially what happens when the government comes in and says you can't charge more than $200 here. So in the normal market conditions, remember that equilibrium was $300, Right, so now the government's stepping in and saying, you can't charge more than some $200 mark here. Right? So now what's going to happen is that we're going to have this, we're out of equilibrium, right? So we know that quantity supplied is going to be different than quantity demanded at that price. Right? So clearly, obviously, at a lower price now, more people are going to want to buy it, and less people are going to want to sell it. So what we call this is a shortage, right? More people want it than can have it, so we're short some units. So what we can first calculate, first we can calculate what these two new values are. Remember, the original one was 100 there. The new quantity demanded is just going to be what happens when we plug a price of 200 into the demand equation, which is going to get us, I'll do that real quick. So if we plug in 200 to the demand equation, we'll get 200 equals 800 minus 5Q. Right, so 5Q is equal to 600, and so Q is equal to 120. Right, so that will give us 120 for this quantity right here. Right, now we can do the same thing and plug in 200 to the supply equation to figure out what the new quantity supplied is. So we just plug in 200 to this equation, which is going to be 200 equals 100 plus 2Q. So that's going to imply that 2Q equals 100. So Q will equal 50. So this is 50 right here. So obviously I didn't draw this completely to scale, but the idea is that the quantity supplied is lower now than the quantity demanded is, and so we're going to have a shortage of 70 units there. So now we can look, at what the effects on consumer and producer surplus are after this price ceiling. So remember, previously consumer surplus was this whole upper area, right? And producer surplus was this whole lower area. But now nobody can charge above a price of 200. So what's going to happen is that obviously suppliers, there's going to be no more than 50 units in the market. This is the total number of units that are going to be sold, right? So the same idea holds for producer surplus. It's just going to be a smaller area now, right? We're going to have now producers, these guys still would have been willing to sell at this low price, but now they sell at 200. So there still is some producer surplus, but now it's just this smaller triangle down here, right? But only up until 50 units. Right? Nobody gets any surplus from any of these missing 50 units because they're not there anymore. They're not being produced anymore. Consumers, right, similarly, these guys actually benefit more from this now because they get to have an even lower price, right? So they get all of this benefit down here, right? But again, only up until 50 because they don't get anything from these 50 units that are missing. So that their new consumer surplus is going to be this upper triangle. So now we can calculate what these are. Right. So this lower triangle here, I'm going to erase it and make it look like this so I can write it. This is producer surplus, right? And this area in here is our new consumer surplus. Right? Remember that it used to be the total surplus in the economy used to be this big triangle, but now we kind of cut off this little nose of it here because we stopped production 50 units short. So this little triangle at the end here is called our welfare loss or deadweight loss. That's our welfare loss, right, from having this. So we can calculate what all three of these areas are. This one's just going to be the area of a triangle here, and it's going to be the triangle. So the new producer surplus is going to be 1/2. Our base is 50. 50 times height, which is this 200 minus 100, which is 100. Right, so 5,000 divided by 2 is equal to 2,500. That's our new producer surplus. If you remember, that's significantly lower than it was in the previous problem. And then our new consumer surplus, this one will be a little bit trickier to calculate because we have We got a triangle up here somewhere, right, and then this rectangle down here. So to do that, we're going to have to, so this 300 goes for this price right here. It's 300. Now we need to find what this price is right here. And what we do for that is we plug in 50 to the demand equation, and that's going to give us what this price is. So we plug in 50 to quantity in there. We're going to have 800 minus 250, which is 550. 800 minus 250, yeah. So 550 right there. Right. So now we're going to have this area, the area of this upper triangle of consumer surplus is this base times this height. Just don't worry about this algebra, it just gets tricky, but the point is that you understand how to do it. Anyway, so we'll have this upper area here, which is going to be 250, 1/2, is 50, right, times 250, whoops, times 250, or 12,500 divided by 2, which is 6,250 maybe. Yeah, so again, don't worry about calculating that in your head. You can just use a calculator or something. That's 600,250 plus the area of this lower thing here, which is 350, which is, you know, this rectangle here, which is 350 times 50 times 50, which is 500. And I'm not even going to attempt to add those two numbers in front of you. That's 23,750, obviously. Point is, that's the consumer surplus, which we see actually, I believe, increased from the previous example. Producer surplus decreased, but the overall surplus in the economy decreased, and that's by exactly this triangle here. And that's going to be the deadweight loss or the welfare loss. I'll call it welfare loss, is this area, this triangle here, which is 1/2 350, which is this base here, times height, which is 50. Again, that's some number that you shouldn't be able to calculate in your head. That's 8,750 as the welfare loss here. So we lost $8,750, just disappeared from the economy. That's the idea. Don't worry about computing all the numbers and stuff, but the idea is that when we put a price ceiling on, some people benefit, the consumers benefit because they get to buy at a lower price. Some lose though because they can no longer buy the units they were previously able to buy because we cut it off at 50 here. And producers are worse off because they get to sell less units and at a lower price. Right. Hopefully that helped you understand a little bit more about how price ceilings and affect kind of consumer and producer surplus. If you have any more questions, go to the Econ Tutoring Center.